Welcome, everybody. Good evening. For those of you I haven't yet gotten to meet, my name is Jason Rubenstein. I have the honor and privilege of serving as the Howard M. Holtzman Jewish Chaplain at Yale, and just the great joy tonight of facilitating a conversation with Professor Shelly Kagan. Professor Kagan is the Clark Professor of Philosophy at Yale, the author of many acclaimed books, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and just a beloved figure in the Yale intellectual and spiritual scene, someone who is willing to talk about basically any topic over lunch, the kind of building those places that are both social and friendship and intellectual all at the same time, which is, what we all went into this business for and treasure most about our time at college. And someone who's been really generous as a member of the Yale community. Been here 25 years in welcoming me the past year and a half. So I want to take this opportunity to say thank you. And for all of you who are watching online, first, we are being recorded, so you should know that before you put anything in the chat that you don't want to be on the front pages of the New York Times tomorrow. And that recording will be on the internet for posterity. And I just first want to say how much I value and on some very profound, simple level need moments of connection to people like this. And the thing that has especially been making me kind of anticipate this evening is that I find that most of my conversations fall into kind of two camps. One is conversations that are about coronavirus, which are kind of worried, anxious, fearful, very swayed by whatever piece I just read in The Atlantic or whatever this day's statistics are, and kind of, feel a little bit like mired in, somehow both a lack of traction and quicksand. Or on the other hand, trying to think or talk about anything else. Some kind of remember that there are other books on my shelf. In fact, all the books on my shelf are not about coronavirus. There are other parts of the newspaper. There are other parts of human life. And those conversations are kind of failing to grab me right now. Like I just can't really sink into them and care about them. And this evening, I think, is the opportunity for the meeting place between those to actually have some of that, kind of the ray of light that comes from outside of the ark or the cave that is about a higher plane of thinking and reality, and also very, very much connected to and grounded in this really perplexing, unsettling, scary, painful time we're in. And the idea of bringing those together and kind of remembering that these disciplines that we study, which in many ways are an escape and a privilege, are also have things to say and can offer resources and insights in our moment. And also moments like this can really shape disciplines and ethics, is the spirit that's brought us here. So the way we're going to do this is Professor Kagan's going to offer kind of an opening gambit. We're going to take questions in the chat. There's a chat function at the bottom. You can chat them to everyone, or you can chat them directly to me, and I will moderate. So periodically I'll kind of interrupt, say, hey, there's a bunch of questions on this vein, and I'll pick someone and I'll actually unmute you and ask you to ask the question in your own voice. Professor Kagan will respond. People can respond to that in the chat also. And the idea is, within the constraints of the medium, to not have a lecture, if you're going to put that on this end, and also not have just a Q&A directly with Professor Kagan, but really to kind of push beyond that to a conversation they'll have this evening. And I do want to say, as a pro tip, for someone who has been on a few of these big Zoom calls, one of the delights of the Zoom calls is the private chat. You need those because there's no way to lean over to the person next to you and whisper something, which is part of the fun, the conspiratorial fun of large gatherings. But also, you probably see some people on here you haven't seen in a long time, and you should drop them a line and say hi also. And that's part of what this is custom built for. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and turn the mic over to Professor Kagan, and again, send your questions to me or to everyone in the chat, and I will guide us through the next hour. We're all yours.
Great. Thank you, Jason, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight. Obviously, we all wish we were gathering under better circumstances. But as Jason said in the description from the Slivka site, the coronavirus presents us with a variety of ethical questions that it's difficult to think about on one's own. And just a couple of remarks in a preliminary way. So I teach a class, Intro Ethics, pretty much every year, and I just had the last lecture this morning. And as I remarked this morning, at the beginning of the semester, when I began to talk about the choices between these rival moral theories and the various kinds of hypothetical examples that I gave periodically to illustrate the theories and how they differ from one another, it all seems very abstract and removed. And here it is just a few months later, and these things are pressing in on us in totally unanticipated ways. The moral questions, really there's far too many for us to touch upon even tonight. I had a couple, Jason and I had a couple that we came up with in the course of thinking about this session. But the truth of the matter is, if there are particular questions or quandaries or puzzles that you especially would like us to be talking about, as Jason said, just put that into the chat box, and he'll periodically just interrupt me with my blessings to say, here's an interesting question or set of questions that people have been wondering about. The other thing I want to say by just way of setting things up is, unlike a typical lecture, you shouldn't really expect that the result's going to be, I'm going to give you a bunch of answers. If you were listening to a webinar on the COVID virus, you would be told, here's what we know right now. That's not my aim here. Although I have views about what the right answers are for some of the questions we may end up thinking about, it's not at all my goal to say, here's what you must believe and here's why you must believe it. I'm much more inclined to say, here are some of the factors you might want to think about in trying to work out an answer for some of these questions, or at least an answer to your own satisfaction. That said, let me just throw a topic out. Actually, let me start by mentioning a couple of topics that we could in principle talk about. We've got a little bit less than an hour, so we're certainly not going to be able to talk about all of them at any kind of length. One topic that I thought it was possible that we might set ourselves up with initially is not a question that at least many of us are going to have to face directly, but society is going to have to deal with, namely questions about the allocation of scarce resources. We know that the time may be upon us in some areas, will be upon us in other areas where there aren't enough ventilators to go around, and we're going to have some sort of policy in place about who gets the ventilator, or once there are vaccines, but they're not enough for everybody initially, who gets the vaccines, or who gets a bed or what have you, who gets tested for the coronavirus. So that's a question I've got some thoughts on. Another one has to do with a question that Jason was interested in, the question about, with the talk of reopening the society, get the economy going again, what kind of moral issues are there? Is it even legitimate to be thinking about putting economic interests of this sort on the same plane to be weighed against the possibility of extra people getting sick and dying? There are questions about the people who are providing the essential services, both people at the front line, nurses, doctors, other healthcare providers, and for that matter, people who are doing the deliveries of your groceries from Instacart. What kind of obligations do any of these people have to be placing themselves in danger by exposing themselves to larger numbers of the population? Do they have obligations to be helping us in that way? Where do these obligations come from? These are some of the questions that have come to mind over the course of dinner. Another question was brought up. My wife asked me, some of her colleagues have been wondering about whether in ordering food deliveries, you're doing something wrong because you are now basically incentivizing somebody to expose themselves to a greater risk. Are you harming them? Is it wrong in some other way? So as I say, there's a variety of questions, and I'm eager to hear both whatever questions particularly intrigue you and what your thoughts are on some of them. That said, until we get going, unless Jason's already got something.
I've got one here. This is, I think, a great one, following up on what he said. So Fred Cantor, I'm going to try to find you and unmute you. I think I can do that in the participant list here. So Fred, you ready? I'm gonna unmute you, and I would love for you to ask this question.
My question.
You are unmuted. Go for it.
My question is: you've talked about the plight of those providing our services, My question is, what responsibility do the employers, both private and public, have to those employees who are providing essential services?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I suppose normally we do think of ourselves as having, and I think appropriately so, responsibilities to our employees. I guess that's a generalization of the question that I mentioned a moment ago that my wife brought up over dinner. If I hire somebody, if I go to Instacart, I have to confess, I don't do this, I'm not competent, but she goes to Instacart and she orders groceries, and then somebody comes to our house, and if we interact with them at some level, we try to keep our distance, but perhaps in other cases they don't. Are we responsible for this? Are we exposing them to a risk that we shouldn't be responsible for putting them in that position? The thing about focusing on people who are providing essential services is you can see the argument for wanting to still be in the business of, I mean, it's not as though we think, okay, so we don't want to be having nurses be exposed to risk, so let's shut down the hospitals. That seems pretty clearly not the move that we want to be taking. But at the same time, it does seem pretty clear to me that we've got responsibilities, especially if it's a direct employer situation with regular ongoing employees, to doing what we can to safeguard them, to provide them with, to the extent that we can, the personal protective equipment. There was, I think it was a letter to the Times last week that I'd mentioned to Jason, where it was a cashier at a market saying that she estimates that over the course of any given day, she's exposed to about 300 people, presumably from fairly close quarters, because they're giving their groceries, they're handing her the money or the credit card or what have you, she's bagging them or speaking to them, what have you. But it's not the case that her employer is providing them with masks. So even that minimal protection isn't really there. Part of me wants to say that seems pretty irresponsible on the part of the supermarket owner. On the other hand, we all read in the paper constantly about the widespread shortage of masks. And so it's not 100% clear what the market owner could be doing, even if they were interested in providing this sort of protection. In some cases, there are things that could be done. I think I've seen pictures, perhaps you have as well, where plastic barriers have been put up so as to minimize the chances of some sort of contact. And so it does seem to me plausible to think that you're responsible for your employees. And so you need to at least be thinking about, are you doing what's within your capacities to protect them? I'm not sure whether anybody else has jumped in, Jason, or should I just start talking up?
Yes, we've got a couple here. I'm going to ask Aaron Sabarium to unmute yourself. It's a fascinating question.
Hi, Shelly. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
My question is about some of the triage policies. A lot of the discussion has centered on likelihood of survival, pre-existing conditions. It's a very utilitarian framework. Since you've done a lot of work on desert, I'm curious, do you think that there is a role for moral desert in some way? For example, if two people of exactly equivalent health, both get really sick, one went on spring break in Florida and was really irresponsible, the other one, was really responsible in trying a social distance. Is there some role for desert when it comes to deciding who gets a ventilator? Could we even integrate that into the triage somehow?
Right. So, so if you think about that, that's a great question. Right? So you think about what kind of consideration should go into our decision who to give a ventilator to, just for the sake of concreteness. And it's easy to say something like, well, we really shouldn't be making decisions. It's not our place to play God. Let it be done by, I don't know, first come, first serve, or if two people show up simultaneously, flip a coin, have a lottery or something like that. I'm not myself inclined, attracted to the idea that we should wash our hands in the attempt to actually make the hard moral choices here. As you just suggested, one prominent thought here is you ask a kind of mixture of questions about who is likely to survive, who's most likely to be cured as a result of being given the ventilator? How many years more are they likely to get if, you know, a young person versus an old person? Some of these things can be brought under the broad rubric, as you said, of the utilitarian perspective. This, for those of you who are not, it's been a long time since you've been exposed to your class in moral philosophy. This is roughly the view that says right and wrong is a matter of doing the action that does as much good for as many people as possible. And when you can't help everybody, you have to make the hard choices about who's likely to benefit or be benefited more. But you raised the especially nice question about, do we also want to pay attention to desert? So imagine that the person who is now in need of a respirator is there because they got COVID-19, because they're a nurse working at the front lines, and that's how they got sick. Whereas somebody else, you gave the, you know, the nice disparaging illustration of the student who during spring break was reckless and deliberately went to the beaches thinking they're young and healthy and not going to get sick. We might think, well, you know, somebody who has actually been providing this essential social benefit deserves to be at the front of the line when it comes time to be aided, given that we can't help everybody. You know, it's not as though, I can't imagine anybody here would want to say something like, oh, you know what, even if we had enough ventilators, we're going to teach that student a lesson and not provide them with any kind of resources. No, we don't want to say that they deserve to be suffering, but it's compatible nonetheless with that thought to say, but if you can't help everybody, maybe some people deserve to be in front, that it's in front of the line. And it's not just a matter of how sick are they? It's not just a matter of who's younger or who's older, but have they earned the right by virtue of having exposed themselves for the sake of society? Speaking personally, I'm quite sympathetic to weighing in desert in that way. But just to show you how complicated these things become, it's easy for me here to sit and say, yeah, pretty clear to me that a nurse or a doctor who got sick because they were in the hospital, in the ER, you know, taking care of patients, pretty easy for me to say that this is a group that deserves more. But when you start asking what other groups might deserve more, it's going to become, I think, very, very contentious. What about the person who owns the company that's manufacturing the masks? Do they deserve to be given first crack? What about politicians who are making the policies that you may or may not agree with, but are, at least in principle, some of them trying to make decisions on their social behalf? Do they deserve first crack at it? Once you start talking about who deserves more, you're going to open up the door to a variety of considerations where inevitably they'll be controversial. But it's a really important thought, though. Jason,
So
you got something else?
we've got, yeah, so first Pearl, do you want to chime in here? I'm unmuting you because you raised something to everyone on the outcome side, which I think is important here. And I see it's gotten picked up.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if it's been picked up, but I've been reading a lot about this concept of saving people who have more years of life left. So you save a 30-year-old, if you've only got one ventilator, you give it to the 30-year-old and not the 70-year-old. And my concern is that that's a form of ageism.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a philosopher at Brown who has regularly made this point, that she thinks this is a form of discrimination. It's ageism, as you put it. You know, ageism, you know, it's just discrimination against the elderly. Now, of course, in one point of view, you might say, look, the mere fact that they're old, you know, let's suppose we had to choose between helping a young person or helping an older person. We don't have enough ventilators for both, or don't have enough vaccines for both. We might think, on the one hand, the fact that the older person is older certainly doesn't mean that they're not enjoying their life, that they have a worse quality of life. That needn't be the case at all. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily discrimination to decide that you want to favor the young. You might have the thought, well, look, other things being equal, we can provide 80, maybe too many, but 50 extra years of healthy life if we give it to the 20-year-old, 50 or 60 years, or maybe even more. Whereas if we give it to a 70-year-old, then we're probably looking at best at 10, maybe 20 extra years of life. It's not that you're saying elderly person's a year of their life counts for less than a year of life of the younger person. It's that you can just literally do more good, other things being equal. In the same way that if we had to choose between, suppose that somebody's got a migraine and you've got some painkiller, and somebody else has a paper cut, and you can give them the medication. You don't have enough to help both. It's not, I don't know what the term would be, paper cutism, to say, no, I'm going to give it to the person with a migraine. You're saying, tragically, when it can't help everybody, where can I do the most good? That's one possible interpretation of why you might want to prefer helping the younger. Another one is actually more of an egalitarian sentiment, that if you think that we're equally deserving, other things being equally deserving, then we all ought to have an equal shot at having a satisfying, lengthy life. Even if it would be horrible that the 70-year-old dies at the age of 70, at least they've had 70 years, whereas if the 20-year-old dies, they've only had 20 years. And so this is akin to saying, if I've got a meal and there's somebody who's only, has been hungry for days versus somebody who's eaten yesterday and is slightly hungry today, you might want to give it to the poorer person, the person who's been hungrier for longer, out of egalitarian sentiments. You may or may not accept these particular moral values, but I don't think we should just dismiss them as mere prejudice, mere discrimination against the aged. Jason.
So they're not kowtowing to those labels. I want to ask Neil Herbsman to speak. Neil is a physician practicing in the Bronx, which was described today in the Washington Post I saw as the ground zero of the ground zero. And just, Neil, you share some of your experience and also what kind of questions are on your heart and mind being on the front lines right now?
Yeah, sure. So I'm somewhere in between the front and not on the front lines. I'm a gastroenterologist and I work full-time for Montefiore, so I have some responsibilities relating to the hospital. I cover in the hospital with the fellows and any patient problems that need patient consultation about once every 4 to 6 weeks. So the beginning to mid of March, I spent more than a handful of days inside the hospital, and last week, but I'm not there 8 to 12 hours a day. But I've had a significant amount of experience with COVID patients and my own dilemmas, moral and otherwise. And to me, it's been a very difficult experience. Some of it has been very uplifting in terms of what I've seen in terms of the response to society, and some very illusioning and creating problems in terms of moral dilemmas. One of them being what society's responsibility is to healthcare workers, and in terms of a reciprocal obligation, has spent a significant amount of time looking back and seeing what had been done in the past in terms of various epidemics, not as serious as this one, but and SARS. And it's apparent to me and to my colleagues, this didn't necessarily sneak up on us, and there was plenty of time for society to prepare, and that there might have been choices that were made, or otherwise, not to have enough protective equipment, not to have plans in place. And now we're called upon to operate in an environment where we don't have necessarily the resources that we need, and it creates a moral dilemma as what is our responsibility when we feel that society hasn't appropriately taken care of their responsibilities beforehand. And in ensuing what happened with our various healthcare systems, and I don't want to malign where I work, because it's a very difficult situation trying to navigate the resources that are available and the need to take care of patients. Sometimes there's a feeling that there's not transparency, and we're told to use certain types of equipment one week, and then the following week we're told, okay, now you should wear a mask everywhere you are in the hospital. And the week beforehand, we were told that there might be disciplinary consequences if we wear them inappropriately. And it's this feeling that I think that there's some kind of obligation for some transparency, and when there's no transparency, it makes it difficult to motivate people in terms of their obligations. So those are a ton of other issues. I mean, I could talk all night long and it would monopolize everything. So, but those are some of the issues that have come up between me and my colleagues in the hospital.
If I can just say that, first of all, Neil, thank you for being there, in the hospital. I've got it pretty safe and pretty cushy, right? I'm holed up in my home with my family, and nothing gets much more dangerous than bringing in the groceries that have been delivered. And so, really, my admiration and gratitude to people like you who are really putting yourselves out there. The thing about how the hospital is constantly changing their mind about what should be done. Because I'm not there, I find myself much less ready to know who to blame about something like that. I'm perfectly prepared to blame the government for not having thought harder in the face of all of these experts saying we have to be thinking about the next pandemic. And I'm prepared to blame the government for not having stockpiled relevant supplies and the like. But if the administration in your hospital is thrown for a loop from week to week, just how infectious is this? How dangerous is this? Everybody is playing catch up with this. And I think it's hard to know which policy is still going to seem sensible even a few days later. Just to give a trivial example of this, I'm in charge of admissions for the philosophy department at Yale this year, and barely 6 weeks ago, we were beginning to face the question: should we cancel our standing program to invite the admitted students to come visit before they had to make a decision about where to go? And we went back and forth about this, and we were tearing our hair out. Is this premature? Should we cancel this? Should we not cancel? Is it responsible? Are we making a mistake relative to other departments? Eventually, we did decide to, with grave misgivings. 3 days later, a mere 3 days later, looking back, it was painfully obvious to everybody in every philosophy department in the country that, of course, you needed to cancel these things. How could we have been so stupid 3 days earlier? So it's always easy to think that changing your mind shows there hasn't been a lot of thought, but we're always trying to catch up with the facts. On the other hand, another value that you said seems right as well, which is transparency. There are, we also read, I read the paper, and there are stories in the paper on a regular basis. There was an op-ed piece today by a nurse located in Pittsburgh talking about how the administration of her hospital fired her for publicly complaining about some of the ways the administration is run. That's obviously appalling. And to the extent that hospitals aren't merely having to regularly change their mind about what's in the best interests of their employees and their patients, but is simply trying to, cover their ass, that's another matter altogether.
I want to bring up a totally different angle here. Lauren Crane, I believe is her last name, shared a reflection in the chat with me about her experience in India, and the way that questions of large scale, really kind of macroeconomic questions of wealth, like, is it possible to spend $4 trillion a country doesn't have to get people through this, or are we going to be facing abject starvation? So Lauren, would you kind of share what this question looks like from your perspective?
Yeah, hi, thanks for doing this. So my last sabbatical several years ago, I was with my family in India, and in order to get anything done, we had a driver who took the kids to school, and we had the woman who came and cleaned our house, and we had, the person who did our laundry. And so when the shutdown hit, we're actually still in touch with the driver who took our kids to school. And so we called him to see how he's doing, and he had 200 rupee or something left at that point. He was heavily, in general, he's heavily dependent on tourists coming to Varanasi. And so the shutdown really means he's not getting any money at all, and he is you know, among lower income folks, he was probably doing better off than some. And so here in the US, you know, we're shutting down to protect, really, you know, everyone's at risk somewhat, but really we are hunkering down to protect a certain segment of the population that we recognize are maximally vulnerable. Again, we're protecting everyone, but we're focused on them especially. And yes, the rest of us are undergoing hardship, but in the US, it's very unlikely, it seems, that anyone will literally starve to death because of the shutdown. Whereas in India, it seems that there is a segment of the population that may very well literally starve to death because everyone is shutting down to protect another part of the population that would be dying in some other way. So what do we do with that? And does that really, two different types of death hanging in the balance, does that map on to the choice we're making here, economy versus, you know, saving people from COVID? Or is it really two different questions that don't map onto each other?
I'm not sure I caught the name. Was that Lydia, the name of the person who was just talking?
Lauren.
Lauren, sorry. I try to write down these names, but I don't always remember to do it in time, and I have a very bad memory. So right, I mean, look, even here in the United States, you know, all you have to do is open up the newspaper or watch 5 minutes of one of the Trump briefings to see the president talking about how important it is to get the economy going back again. And this won't be probably news to anybody. I'm no fan of Trump. That's a gross understatement. And I don't myself think that, I cynically think that the only thing that's really motivating Trump here is a desire for the stock market to recover so that it'll enhance his chances of getting reelected. But in the same way that even a broken clock can be correct till the right time twice a day, even Trump may be on to something legitimate in the way that Lauren is pointing out. Wonder about whether or not it's morally, I mean, when you raise the worry about whether or not keeping the economy shut down is morally the right thing to do. I'm not any kind of economist, any kind of sociologist. I'm not remotely in a position to say, is it or is it not the case in the United States that by virtue of the economy being shut down, anybody's going to starve to death. There's enough poverty in the country that I certainly think that things like that may well happen. We know that there are people who are unemployed who can't pay their rent, and then we know that there are landlords who are saying, tough, you owe it to me. Some states have no eviction policies in place, but other states presumably don't. So you're quite right, Lauren, to suggest that, you know what, this isn't just lives versus money. This is lives versus lives. And in principle, it seems to me, yeah, that's right. There are calculations here that need to be made. If the economy stays shut down for this long in this extent, then who's going to suffer in what sorts of ways? In principle, these are the kinds of calculations that economists sometimes try to make when they do their cost-benefit analyses. Cost-benefit analysis gets a very bad rap often among moral philosophers. There are various issues that perhaps it rides too roughly over, not the least of which is the question about desert that got mentioned earlier. Nonetheless, it seems to me these sorts of questions are questions that it's perfectly appropriate to be asking. Even if it wasn't a matter of lives being endangered. I mean, you can imagine somebody taking the moral high road and saying, suppose that we somehow had a sufficient safety net in place such that nobody was going to starve, nobody was going to get evicted, and we're just talking about convenience, then surely we shouldn't be trading off lives for convenience. That sounds all very, as I say, high-minded, but even that, I think, is something that we could question. To make an analogy, maybe it's more than an analogy, but to give an illustration of how we often do make these sorts of trade-offs from a completely different area. Think about something like the speed limit on the highway. It's a simple fact that when you have the speed limit at 65, you have more fatal car accidents. And if you had the speed limit, I'm old enough to remember when the speed limit on the interstate was 55. When the speed limit's 55, you have fewer deaths. And if you ask, why do we raise it to 65? Because when the speed limit's 55, and of course, if we lowered it to 45, there'd be fewer deaths still, and 35 fewer deaths still. to some extent, to a very minor extent, having the slower speed might, delay essential medical resources getting to some hospital in time and there'll be lives lost. But mostly it's just a matter of convenience. If you can only drive 45, it takes you that much longer to drive to your child in Boston. And what society does is it says it's worth giving up a certain number of lives in order to have convenience. We know that every time we build a skyscraper, maybe every time, I don't really know, but often enough when we build a skyscraper or a bridge, people die. And so why do we do that? Because it's more convenient to be able to drive across the Sound than to drive all the way around. So even when it's a matter of convenience, I think there are choices to be made here. But certainly, as Lauren said at the outset, in countries where it's a simple fact that if the economy shut down too severely and for too long, people will die just another way. I'm not myself inclined to think that there's something less morally bad about death by starvation than death by the virus. Great point.
Great. So I want to, first of all, I want to take a quick pause for station identification. I said when we got to 180, down to 180, we were peaked about 187. It would be people, maybe we're starting to drop off. Wanted to let y'all know that this, our hope is that next month and in subsequent months, we'll actually be having conversations like this, these kind of Slipka online salons. May is lined up for Lisa Blatt, who has argued more cases before the Supreme Court than any other woman, talking about the place of the court in democracy, and it's especially its increasingly contested place. And with that, I want to shift right back to Nick Jacobson, who has brought up what to my mind is a totally fascinating question, that if you kind of take a utilitarian, pure utilitarian, how many years does someone have left, you will end up, it seems like, favoring, white and wealthy 35-year-olds over African-American or poorer 35-year-olds. So Nick, would you kind of flesh out that concern for us?
Yeah, so I've spent the past semester working at Yale's Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, which it was quite a transformation, the job, as you might imagine, as we sort of moved into the crisis. And we were most recently have been working a lot on triage policy and how to design a system for triage to figure out who to prioritize for ventilator access, basically, whose lives to save. And one of the sort of general, ideas is, well, you factor in what kind of conditions people are bringing in to the hospital so that you can figure out who is going to have the best chance of survival and whose life you're going to be most successful at saving, and then put your resources there. And one of the things that gets factored in there that people have to think about is age, that we've talked about. But another is what we do with just the sort of systemic disparities in our society that say that, even in New Haven, the neighborhoods with the highest rates of smoking are often dominated by minority communities and people in lower socioeconomic status. So the question is, if we prioritize our triage system based on likelihood of recovery, logic that makes a lot of sense, we could end up helping people, primarily white and wealthy people. But the alternative is that we actually end up potentially could end up sacrificing life for the preservation of social equality. So I'm just curious where you fall on the spectrum, or what thoughts you bring to it.
I'll share my own thoughts in a second. Was Nick the name of the person that was just speaking?
Yes, yeah. That's right.
So Nick, you've raised the question, but you didn't tip your hand. Maybe the fact that you raised it tips your hand, but where do you come down on that yourself?
Well, so we were working on figuring out how to incorporate the needs for people of lower socioeconomic status, and what we had come up with tentatively was We did research on identifying what the term that I learned in the job was comorbidity. You know, the sort of other diseases, other conditions that contribute to your likelihood of recovery from the disease. And so what we worked on was identifying comorbidities, both associated with COVID-19 and disproportionately, largely disproportionately affecting minority communities, such as end-stage renal disease was one of the big ones. Alzheimer's was another one. So that we could figure out that these comorbidities maybe would factor less into the calculations, into triage calculations, which end up just being numbers. Basically, people just get scores, and then lower scores are better. So we had thought about maybe you could have a system where comorbidities that we know disproportionately affect minorities are factored less heavily into triage policy.
I mean, the way you put it, you know, initially that this ultimately becomes a kind of trade-off between equality on the one hand, or an egalitarian sentiment on the other, and what we might loosely refer to as a utilitarian consideration on the other. The professor part of me thinks that's probably not the ideal label, but it's not worth quibbling over the label. But the thought is, you know, quantity of life versus an egalitarian value. That seems exactly right. If you had somebody, and go back to the example of the 20-year-old versus the 60-year-old or the 70-year-old, and you know, imagine that you could either give the 60-year-old 20 more years or the 20-year-old 10 more years. If all you care about is quantity of life, then that's an argument for giving more to the 60-year-old. But if you have egalitarian sentiments, you might think, wait a minute, the 20-year-old had a much smaller piece of the pie than the 60-year-old already has. Even if we only give them 10 years, they'll still end up with a smaller pie overall than the 60-year-old has had. Egalitarian sentiments might lead you in a situation like that to decide, maybe that case is too extreme, but at least cases like this might lead you to decide to save the person who's had less, especially if you think it's not their fault, you know, that they've had less. The first question, I think it was the first comment, started talking about, the very first question talked about, you know, the teenagers, you know, during spring break, the college students, whatever, who went off, you know, crowding the beaches. You know, you might think it's their fault, but then Nick's pointing out precisely when you think that if some of the reasons some of the people who are less healthy, and so perhaps will get less overall benefit, is because they're minority groups, and minority groups in general have, you know, suffer for a variety of reasons, which I imagine I don't need to really explain to anybody, you know, on this session. You might think it's not their fault. And this brings us back as well to the question about desert. You might think if people are equally deserving, there's a priority that needs to be given to people who have fallen farther from getting what they deserve. And it might even be that if you had to choose between giving a smaller benefit to somebody who's as deserving as somebody else, but is much further away, doing less well off, or giving a larger benefit to somebody who's no more deserving, but is much better off, you might think considerations of desert do trump merely adding up the number of lives, simply going for quantity of life. Now, these are controversial questions within moral philosophy. As it happens, I myself am deeply sympathetic to the thought that desert should weigh into an adequate moral theory. I think a simple utilitarian calculus is probably precisely for that reason too simple. So that's right. I mean, I think Nick raises a really serious point. If you're going to have an adequate triaging system, it's not enough to just talk about who's most likely to get cured. It's not enough to just talk about who is sickest. It's not enough to talk about how many years can we give people. We have to talk as well about, are they part of an oppressed class, and is the fact that they're now less likely to have the same health recovery due to their being treated unjustly in other ways, that seems relevant as well.
I want to ask a fascinating question of triaging from the other side, which Rebecca, who's a practicing doctor at a major NYC hospital, brought up about whether the shifts that needed to be done by healthcare workers should also be triaged by age, either because of increased danger or because of if, well, one of us is going to get it, it should maybe be the older person. So Rebecca, would you just lay out what it's like and how these decisions are being made and how you and your colleagues are talking and thinking about them?
Oh, sure. So, I mean, I think, with regards to the question of discrimination, right? It's not enough to say it's discriminatory. There's appropriate ways to discriminate and inappropriate ways to discriminate. And I think that, some of the discrimination that's going on is very appropriate. So, for example, in my institution, Columbia Presbyterian, doctors who are above the age of 60 are not being redeployed to the COVID floors, which in my opinion, of course it's discriminatory, but it's to protect that category of people. I'm a neuroimmunologist, so a lot of my patients are immunosuppressed. So I'm spending a lot of time saying, these immunosuppressed patients should not be working and should not be working. They need extra protection. So I think the issue of, discrimination can sometimes be appropriate. That's kind of my thoughts.
That seems right. And actually, your remark about the word discrimination seems right as well. I mean, sometimes we use the word discrimination in a value neutral or even commendatory sense, right? This person has a discriminating palate, right? But often we use the term discrimination for differential treatment that we think cannot be morally justified. And we probably shouldn't get hung up on the word. We should get hung up on which sorts of differential treatments are justified on the basis of what sorts of values. If we think that certain people are at higher risk, then there's obviously an argument for not putting them at the front line. The harder case is still, not that that's an easy case, but the harder case still becomes when the people at the front line themselves fall ill. And now you've got to be calling on, or at least face the question about calling on people that otherwise you'd want to be protecting. But these are the ones who are the medical practitioners who are, at a sufficient age or have other health problems. Do you want to be bringing people out of retirement? At that point, we have to also then raise the question, what obligations do the people who have the skill set to be helping others, but are themselves at a higher risk population, they're in the higher risk groups, what kind of obligations do they have to be going in once the tide gets turned? And I don't, that's the wrong expression here, but once that we need them. For the time being, at least in certain contexts, we don't yet need them. Depending on whether we get on top of the virus, we may yet need them. And then the harder question is going to be, can we call on them? Do they have an obligation? Again, in the preliminary meeting when Jason and I talked, he mentioned, that, doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, but, at the same time, as we both pointed out, the Hippocratic Oath, says you're not going to go around harming people. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to feel an obligation to, sacrifice your own health for the sake of helping people. It's all very admirable. And that's not to say that we don't have an obligation. It's just that it's a complicated, controversial issue that we're going to be, sadly, I think, facing more and more in the months ahead.
So I want to bring us to, I think, a different angle here, which Dora Wang and Mandy Katz have brought up here. So I want to ask you to unmute yourselves. And I think there's a larger social frame, which you touched on. You said, you're like, I blame the government for this at one point. And what was so striking about that is just the scale of, and Dora and Mandy, I want to hear your formulations of this, but the way I would put it is, the scale of the effects of our moral choices are so different. Like, I saw this very moving interview by a nurse who quit her job because she felt like the PPE she had was inadequate, and she has an immunocompromised family member at home. She was like, I can't do this to them, but right? It's a tiny sphere of, a half dozen people, and the people she cares for, a few hundred that she works with. Whereas on the other hand, there's a tiny number of people in the government who did a bad job, let's say, and now hundreds of millions of people are living in the effects. And I'm really struck by the question of like, does it even make sense to have a single set of framework of ethics to try to hold those radically different, you know, kinds of implications and scales we're acting on, or is there some kind of special realm and way to analyze them? And Dora and Mindy, you would bring up the kinds of other types of radical inequality and power we're addressing here. Maybe we can put all of that into the mix also.
Yeah, my question is where we are talking about rationing a day on the ventilator, or rationing this or that medical care, when CEOs of healthcare systems are paid somebody, you know, I believe the CEO of United Healthcare, it's $250,000, not a year, but a day. And yeah. And so just the underlying ethics of the system right now, and where it's a for-profit system, which has put a lot of charitable hospitals out of business because they can't compete. And then also just the for-profit system that tries to maximize profits by not having an excess inventory. So therefore you have a shortage of PPE applications. So yeah, I think this calls into question the ethics, the current framework of the healthcare system.
Well, it's not just the ethics of the healthcare system, but you might wonder about the ethics of capitalism altogether, or unfettered capitalism, or something like that. I'm speaking personally, I'm a big fan of a much more thoroughgoing social safety net than we have. I'm a big fan of a much more progressive taxation scheme than we've got. I'm a big fan of much more aggressive prosecution of white-collar crime than we have. We've heard from a couple of people in healthcare. I'm not sure if we've heard from anybody yet in the legal profession. But yeah, it's a crime what people get away with, and part of the crime is that it's not a crime what people get away with. So the question, Jason initially posed the question in terms of special responsibilities of the government. But obviously, it's not just there. And this again brings us back to one of the early questions about responsibilities that all employers have to their employees, of whatever the nature of it is. But obviously, it does scale up, as Jason was suggesting, and that when you end up being somebody who's responsible for hundreds or thousands of employees, or tens of thousands, in some cases. And if you're in charge of some hospital, let alone the hospital chain, then you've got the health interests of thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people potentially that you're responsible for. These are indeed responsibilities. There's a debate again within moral philosophy, the subfield called business ethics, about what are the responsibilities of management? Are they merely to the share owners to maximize profits? That's one view that's out there. Or do you have responsibilities to the clients, the consumers, the patients? I certainly think that the latter is the case as well. To be somewhat harsh about it, but as occasionally, I'll say to friends, family members, what have you, I don't myself believe in hell, but I wish there were one, so that, and then I'll fill my favorite villain of the day, would end up there. I think it's appalling how much society fails to hold responsible people who have positions of power, actually are in a situation to shape policy, whether in their own local institution or society more largely, and don't genuinely use it for the larger social interest. These people are evil. It seems to me is the simple response to it. And sometimes it's more complicated, right? There are places where there's room for differences of opinion. Again, one of the things that Jason and I talked about very briefly, at the in the discussion when we were talking about having this session, you know, what were there any takeaway points I hope people would have? You know, it's not that, I've occasionally shared with you my own views about some of these things, but if we could genuinely, with this many people, we can't really have a seminar. But if we could, and we really did, if I threw out a position and then asked, okay, so who disagrees with that? And we saw which 25 of you or 50 of you disagreed, we'd see there's a lot of disagreement once we get down to the brass tacks about, so are you saying that being a business owner makes you more deserving or less deserving? Are you saying that being a minority member should mean you should go to the front of the line? What if you're a minority member, but you're not a poor minority member? You're an upper middle class black. Should they not go to the front of the line, but only poor blacks? You know, moral questions are really, really difficult. Although that's not to say that all questions here are, all answers are as good as any others. That certainly isn't true here any more than it would be anyplace else. But it is the case that reasonable people disagree about ethical questions. And I think a certain amount of humility is always in place as well when thinking about these things, that some people of good faith and goodwill and good intentions will genuinely disagree with you about how to solve these problems, or what the right solution is, or the right policy, or what their obligations are. And I think we need to be prepared to forgive them for disagreeing with us. One of the earlier commenters remarked that the administration in the hospital seems to be constantly changing their policies. And I think you need to be prepared to forgive them, at least some of them, for thinking, okay, here's what I was saying earlier, but you know what, I've changed my mind and that's not really right. You need to be prepared to forgive yourself for trying your best, as long as you were trying your best to think these things through. And if at a certain point you look back and you say, boy, I really screwed that up, you've got to be prepared to say, these were hard calls. You can't refuse to face these questions, but you've got to recognize that the answers aren't really always obvious.
So it's 9 o'clock here. Professor Kagan, if you and folks are willing to stay into overtime, I'd love to do that. I have 3 questions teed up here. As we kind of mark the end of our regularly scheduled program, I want to make sure, first to, again, thank Professor Kagan. Thank all y'all for really constituting this community. The chat window, which I'm going to preserve, is a great text in its own right. And especially to thank my colleagues, many of them are on this call, and a lot of work went into this behind the scenes. So Ori Cohen, who's the executive director of Slifka Center, Lynn Jackson-Quinn and Evan Wexler, and Jen Wallace, our development director, and also Benjamin Lauford of the communications. It's like a great team, and the kind of seamless conversation that we've experienced is the outgrowth of many conversations that have gone into this. And so I just want to thank all their hard work. So the 3 questions I want to toss out here are, one, Miriam Copito, who's a first year. Her mother is a doctor, but not an infectious disease. Doctor has basically been conscripted to work on a COVID floor, and of course about the ethical implications there. So Miriam, if you would talk about that. Number 2, Ben Beckman, also a first year. First years are representing here. Asked about the kind of mass effects of this kind of disruption. At some point, where do we hit the threshold of it's not worth it anymore? And the third is 2 people, Nick Jacobson and someone much earlier in the text chat, which I can't find now, brought up the question of surveillance. And the cell phone tracking and other things for contact tracing, and where we run into civil liberties things. So maybe if each of the 3 of you could kind of share your voices together, and then Professor Kagan, you'll tie everything up with a bow. And so even though you promised not to do that, I'm gonna try to tempt you into it anyways.
So my mom is a cardiologist who is sort of asked to work in a coronavirus ward, and she has the ability to say no because she works for herself, but for some other of her colleagues who work for the hospital, they're sort of being told, like, work in a coronavirus ward or you will sort of be fired or like lose these privileges. And my question is it ethical for the hospital to do that, given that it's not really the job like that the specialists agree to, or is that sort of part of their like dedication to the health of society? How much can we like weigh this issue? So yeah. And also, what effect will like forcing sort of specialists to work in these wards have on people who have conditions who will die if they're not treated? And that's already happening with people who like aren't going to their regular specialist appointments.
Jason, am I right in thinking you want all three questions to be asked?
Yeah, let's take them all as a group, and then you can kind of address them together.
Ben is next.
Hey, Professor Kagan, thank you so much for talking with us today. So my question is, one of the interesting things about coronavirus is that it has this 3% lethality rate, which in terms of infectious diseases for, I guess, common ones is remarkably high, obviously. But, compared to SARS or MERS, that figure is a little bit lower. So obviously, this is sort of the first time we've seen these global lockdown, global quarantine effects. And obviously, I think one of the questions we'll have to ask is in the future, we're going to see additional infectious diseases. And of course, we've seen them before, like influenza has a small lethality rate, but of course, the seasonal flu kills people every year. But, also, of course, we haven't gone on these mass lockdowns for this seasonal flu before. So my question is where do we draw the line? Because, if there's a 1% lethality rate of a new disease or a 0.5%, how can we determine when or when not to take these large quarantine measures?
Good, Ben. I think the last person was somebody named Nick. Is that right, Jason? I think
Yeah.
Jason has muted himself.
Hi
Nick,
again. Sorry. So it's a quick question. I think it's related to Ben's question. It seems like as people have been talking about reopening the economy and getting, some sort of movement around, or there have been questions about how we're going to contain the spread of the disease and isolate it, which has led a lot of companies and governments around the world and in the United States to develop some sort of tracking mechanisms, mostly through people's mobile devices. We already live under an administration that has shown a pretty blatant disregard for people's privacy rights, persecuting, minorities, immigrants through technology. So how do we balance the need to monitor the spread in an open economy or semi-open economy with concerns about individual privacy and those rights?
These are three amazing questions, and if I were sufficiently intelligent, I'd figure out some brilliant way to synthesize answers to all of them in some unified way. I don't see quite how to do that. So let me just make some quick remarks about each of them. Starting with Miriam about the being conscripted into being at the front lines, even though this wasn't your own area of specialization previously, and you hadn't signed up for it. It's easy to conflate two questions. One, do people have an obligation to run some risks for the sake of others? Even how much of a risk you need to undergo is a controversial matter. But I think most of us would think that, look, just as we're required to give money to charity, that's pretty risk-free, but it does involve some kind of sacrifice. We're required to run some sorts of risks for the sake of helping others. I have views about the nature of those risks, the limits of those risks. It would be way too complicated to go into them. But the point I wanted to emphasize here was, even if you think somebody should be volunteering, it's quite another matter to say that it's permissible for the rest of us to force that person to do it. It's one thing to have an obligation. It's another thing to have it be the case that others are permitted to force you to fulfill your obligations if you, in your own best judgment, think that that's not what you're obligated to do. That sounds like what may be going on in the case of Miriam's mother. Even that's even that's more complicated than I can really do justice to here, because we do think frequently that it is permissible to force people to do something towards meeting their obligations towards others. I mean, that's after all what taxation is under the welfare state. When the government takes my money away, they are forcing me to provide aid to others who need it. Of course, that's not the same thing as running the risk of bodily damage, illness, or death, but the draft is an example of something that most of us feel, if it was done fairly, can in principle be a legitimate thing for a society to impose. Sometimes in order to protect people, we have to force people to do their bit in protecting people. Now, so all that means is I'm open in principle to hearing an argument about why it might be legitimate to use coercive measures to force people to provide health care. But, we don't normally force plumbers to go out and meet plumbing emergencies. If it gets cold and pipes burst, we don't say, now we're going to force you to do this. We don't normally force people to use the skills of their trade. And so I would want to hesitate before I leapt to the conclusion that just because the current problem is a healthcare one, that therefore people in healthcare have special obligations. Even if they do have special obligations, I would think this also would earn them special claims to special forms of compensation. And one doesn't readily hear that being talked about in the same breath, though I think perhaps it should be. There's more to say about that first question, but let me try to move on to the other two. Ben asks about really the question about risks, which is, coronavirus happens to be the cause that we are all thinking about today. For obvious reasons, because it's a kind of health emergency that it certainly seems we haven't seen for 100 years. We don't yet really know the size of it, the magnitude of it. As one reads in the paper, if these precautions work, then of course we will look back and say, what were we worried about? When you've got these kinds of dangers, it's not always obvious what's being properly cautious and what's being overly cautious. But there's the more general point that Ben raised, which is that this is hardly the only problem we're facing. And people don't tend to think very sensibly and rationally about calculating risks and probabilities. People are much more worried about terrorist attacks than they are about all sorts of everyday risks that are much more like, there'll be people who will lose sleep about the possibility of being killed in a terrorist bombing, who will drive without their seatbelts on, even though the risk is much greater of being injured or killed in a car accident than of being, subject to a terrorist attack. People don't think very carefully, very clearly about these things. It's, of course, precisely the reason why you really want to have experts whose job it is to think about these things carefully, and why what one would like would be policymakers, not just about the current crisis, but more generally, policy to be set by people who know what they're talking about. I'm, of course, cynical enough to wish that that were more frequently the case in America. The last question was the one that Nick raised about privacy. And here, this is really just an instance of a broader general question of value trade-offs. We all know the old chestnut that you've got the right to free speech, but it doesn't mean you've got the right to cry fire in a crowded theater. We all have the right to privacy, and the question is, how much privacy is legitimate to take away from us so as to promote public health? I mean, there are various liberties that we think it's appropriate to curtail, not eliminate altogether, but to reduce or curtail. When somebody has an infectious disease, we think it's appropriate to quarantine them, even though this curtails their liberty because they pose a certain kind of threat to others. If it should turn out that surveillance of who's going where was necessary in order to get socially effective distancing in place, I think at least there's a question to be raised there, which is, of course, the very question you were raising about, yeah, there's something to be said for some loss of privacy here. Though, you know, how much, that's too big a discussion for tonight. Some of this may actually be a generational thing. Sometimes in discussions with my own children, I think that my wife and I care much more about privacy in terms of, you know, our information about us being available on the net and the internet. The fact that every time I go any place with my cell phone turned on, you know, my phone company is busy tracking me. That, you know, my kids often say to me, you know, get real. Your privacy is already a figment of your imagination. And we would need to have a whole lot more facts before I could enter into actually intelligent discussions about what kind of further encroachments into our privacy would be worth it in terms of what kind of benefits. I think there are trade-offs that sometimes are legitimate, and these are among the questions that people need to be thinking about in a big way.
I want to share in that vein, one of the third-year law students shared with me this book he was reading, which was, it was kind of an anti-libertarian book in the sense that it was trying to argue against this narrative that, you know, the modern state really gets going in the Great Depression and World War II, and it was small before. And what it goes through basically is argues through the 19th century that for questions of public health, the government exercised these incredible range of powers. And one of the interesting examples is houses that were seen to be like a kind of fire bridge between two neighborhoods. The government could just knock your house down. And since it wasn't purchasing, there's no eminent domain even. And this was like completely unobjectionable. So it's interesting, I mean, you said this is a part of a general framework, but it may actually be that at least in the American political tradition, public health has its own kind of like trump card the government gets to play, you know, rightly or wrongly. But it has that was its kind of core function for a long time.
Yeah, just a quick, you know, reaction to what you're saying, which is, look, there are some goods that, I mean, nobody can provide the good life for themselves in isolation, right? Everybody needs society. In the absence of society, as Hobbes famously said, life would be nasty, poor, solitary, brutish, and short. We all need society. But that said, with society in place, there are some things that to a significant extent you can hope to accomplish for yourself. But public health emergencies are not something you can deal with on your own. And it is one of the places where we all, and I think appropriately, turn to government. I mean, this, of course, you know, to really do justice to the subject, now we have to turn not just from ethics into a broader discussion about what's the basis of political philosophy, you know, what are the rival views, what's the justification for having a state at all. But one of the reasons to have a state is precisely to do things for us that we cannot do for ourselves, you know, like having an army or taking the relevant measures in the case of a public health emergency. When we enter society, Hobbes's thought was, we necessarily give up some of the liberties and rights we would otherwise have retained for ourselves. This is a rational decision to make precisely because the benefits of society outweigh the losses of curtailing or limiting our rights. I'm sympathetic to that kind of argument, but of course that still leaves the hard work of finding the right balance. And that, sadly, is something that's always going to be contested.
Wow, this has given so much to think about. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're getting close to 9:30, so I'm gonna call it an evening. I'm gonna just say thank you again, Professor Kagan. This was the process, as you mentioned many times. Our conversations leading up to this were like just a delight. Hope you all get the chance to carry on similar conversations. And The chat has been really fun. My only regret for this is that not everyone got to share my private chat, which I think was the most interesting of them all. Maybe yours was better, and then, you know, good on you.
Let me just, you know, thank Jason, thank Slivka, thank to all the people behind the scenes who helped make this possible. And thank you all for having been here. And for those of you who stuck it out to the bitter end, I'm especially grateful. I really wish it were the case that we could have something closer to the give and take of conversation. But I think the technology is not quite ready for that yet. But thanks very much. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, be well, y'all. Have a good night. And most importantly, stay safe and healthy.